Williams, Puritan activist. Roger Williams was an English Puritan. He was a radical separatist. He was both a religious and social activist. He was a polemical writer. He wrote lots and lots of stuff, most all of which was quite controversial and very critical. He was the founding father of the first church, Reformed Baptist Church in America. He also founded the colony of Rhode Island, which included the Providence Plantations. He advocated for religious freedom for all persons and championed the separation of church and state. Roger Williams pursued fair dealings with the American Indians, and he studied their languages and culture with a view toward building good relationships between the colonists and the Native Americans that were here. He was also an outspoken abolitionist. He organized one of the first, if not the first, attempt to prohibit slavery in the colonies. Now here's his bio at a glance. Born, died spouse, Mary Barnard, 1629, 6 children, all born in America. And I've already mentioned most of his curriculum vitae, or is it vitae? We don't have our Latin scholars with us tonight. Puritan separatist with a capital S. Roger Williams was born in London around 1603. His father was a very successful merchant. Roger became a Christian at a very early age. I do not have the details. His father disapproved of his Christianity. As a teenager, Roger was apprenticed to a very well-known lawyer, and that had effects on his later life, especially dealing with charters for colonies in the New World. He graduated in religious studies from Pembroke College, Cambridge, in 1627. He had a gift for languages, Latin, Hebrew, Greek, Dutch, French. He actually tutored John Milton in Dutch, and Milton in return tutored him in Hebrew. After graduation, he took holy orders. I need to advance this. After graduation, he took holy orders, which means he became a churchman, a preacher, a priest in the Church of England, the C of E, but he had become a Puritan while he was at Cambridge. As I mentioned earlier, he married Mary Barnard in 1629. They had 6 children, all born in America. Their names were Mary, Freeborn, Providence, Mercy, Daniel, and Joseph. He was also the founder of the hippie movement in America. Now, Roger knew that his fellow Puritans were coming to America seeking religious freedom in the New World. He did not, however, come on the first wave. I'm not sure why. But he believed more than any of the others, as best that I can tell, that the Church of England was totally corrupt and false. It didn't need to be reformed, it needed to be left. By the time that he and Mary boarded ship in December of 1630, he was a dyed-in-the-wool separatist with a capital S. Now, arriving at the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1631, the church in Boston actually asked him to become the interim pastor, and he said no, because he saw it as, quote, an unseparated church. Moreover, at this same time period, he began teaching and sharing his belief that the civil authorities, the magistrates, had no authority to punish anyone guilty of breaking any of the first 4 of the 10 commandments, because they dealt with man's relationship with God, man's responsibilities with God, Sabbath breaking, false worship, idolatry, blasphemy. The civil government should not do anything with those. That's the church's responsibility. He said that individuals must be free to follow their own convictions. This was not well received by his fellow Puritans. He settled briefly in Salem before moving on. Now, at this time, he began to articulate 3 basic principles, and these were central to his beliefs, his teachings, his preaching for the rest of his life. Number 1 is the complete separation of the church from the Church of England. He believed, number two, in personal liberty of conscience for all believers. He called it soul liberty. And number three, he called for and wrote and preached the complete separation of church and state. So he taught that a true believer must completely separate himself from the Church of England and then become a member of a new church that was built on the true worship of God. He set about trying to decide what it looked like, this true worship, and ultimately decided that there would be no true church anywhere at any time until Jesus Christ came back and founded that church. Toward the end of the summer of 1631, he left Salem. He moved to Plymouth. There he informally helped the minister who was there. He regularly filled the pulpit. Then governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Bradford, said that his, quote, his teachings were well approved. But after a short time, Roger Williams decided that the Plymouth church, just like the Boston church, was not sufficiently separated from the C of E. Furthermore, as his contacts with the local Indians, in this case the Narragansett Indians, who are cousins of the Algonquins, his relationships with them led him to begin to question the validity of colonial charters, because those charters said nothing about buying the land from the Indians. He saw it as the colonies taking land that wasn't theirs. So that was not well received. Williams absquatulated from Plymouth and headed back to Salem in the fall of 1633. Now you'll notice that I'm giving months, times of the year, times of the seasons, because so much happened in his life immediately. After a few months, there's a change. A year, and there's another change. Toward the end of the summer of 1631, Williams left Salem. He moved to Plymouth, and he assisted the pastor there. After leaving there, he goes back to Plymouth, and the colony leaders were not pleased that he had come back. After a few months, they summoned him to appear before the General Court in Boston to defend a tract that he had written attacking the king. He said the king did not have the right to issue charters and that their colonial charter should be null and void. They didn't appreciate it. At this point, in court, surprisingly, at least to me, they came to agreement and the issue was smoothed over. Roger agreed to do what they said, at least for a period of time. He actually became the acting pastor of the Salem church during this time, but in March of 1635, he was again ordered to appear before the general court to answer for spoken and written, quoting, erroneous and dangerous opinions. So Williams at that point walked away from the Salem church and he began having church meetings of his followers in his own home. Then in October of 1635, the general court tried him. He was convicted of sedition and heresy. They declared that he was spreading, again quoting, diverse, new, and dangerous opinions and ordered him to be banished, to be thrown out of the colony. Well, he was ill at the time that the verdict came down. So they decided to have mercy on him, and they said that because winter was approaching, and these were New England winters, they have snow there. It's not like Chattanooga. Because he was ill and the snow is coming, they said that he can stay in his house as long as he kept his mouth shut. He didn't keep his mouth shut. So they sent the sheriff to get him. And in January of 1636, the sheriff knocked on his door but found that Williams had slipped away just a few days earlier. In a blizzard, he traveled 55 miles through the snow, and I believe it was all uphill, into a section of Massachusetts where the local Indian tribe, thank you, Jeremy, the Narragansetts were there, and they allowed him to winter with them. Their chief was Massasoit, which is another well-known name from American history. I'm slowly getting the hang of this, I think. Excuse me. In early 1636, Williams and the others from Salem who came with him, they moved to a new piece of land to develop their own settlements, but he found out that he was still inside the land owned by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they told him to leave, which he did. He and his friends rowed across the Seekonk River, and there was no reason that I needed to say Seekonk River except I wanted to say it out loud in church. They rowed across the river into uncharted territory, and they actually bought the land from Chief Massasoit of the Narragansetts. The new settlement was named Providence because he felt that God's providence had brought them there. Roger and Mary named their third child Providence, to which I say, right on. Williams wanted this settlement to be a haven for those, quoting, distressed of conscience, and it soon attracted a collection of various dissenters, including those that he really didn't agree with. Now, most people he didn't agree with, but he really didn't like the Quakers, and George Fox didn't like him. But they were allowed to come into this Providence settlement. From the beginning, and this is regarding the civil authority there, they decided that a majority vote of the heads of the households would civilly govern the new settlement, but only in civil matters. They strongly decided that they would preserve the soul liberty, the liberty of conscience to the individual in all other matters. So, for the first time in the American colonies, there was not only true religious freedom, but also separation of church and state. While he was there in the Providence Plantations, a group of settlements, particularly Providence and a settlement called Warwick. This was before Rhode Island was formed. He solidified his friendships with the local Indians. He wrote an encyclopedia of the Indian language and culture in an effort, as I said earlier, to smooth the relationships with the colonial folk and the Indians. He kept the peace with the Indians and at least the Rhode Island colony for 40 years because he was continually working with them, mediating, negotiating, keeping everybody as best he could safe. Nevertheless, the other New England colonies were afraid of the Indians. They mistrusted them. They feared them. They didn't like them. They didn't want to pay for the land. And they came to regard the Rhode Island colony as an enemy as well. In 1643, the neighboring colonies, Massachusetts Bay and others, they formed a military alliance and a civil alliance to put an end to what they called the heretic settlements. Providence Plantation. In response, Roger Williams hopped on a ship and he went to England in order to get a charter, which I find hilarious. But that's only me. Okay. I can feel my face turning red. Let me make sure I've got my pages in the correct order. Yeah, I think I turned over too many. Okay. Next week will be much better. Maybe not. Oh. Okay, the Charter of Rhode Island. Williams sailed to London. It was the time of the English Civil War. Cromwell and the Roundheads are fighting King Charles I, who got so upset that he lost his head. It's funny. The Puritans held power in London, so it's been long enough. The Puritans held power in London, so he was able to get his charter for Rhode Island very quickly. He did this in July of 1644, in spite of the fact that the Massachusetts Bay Colony had sent agents there to speak against him. So after this victory, after getting a colony, and remember he's already purchased the land, he immediately wrote his most famous book, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for the Cause of Conscience. The Puritan Parliament didn't like the book, and I'll read a couple of things in just a minute here. They ordered the hangman to burn all the copies of the book that they could find. Now, Williams himself, we don't know what might have happened. He was already on his ship on the way back to America. Point number 4 is listed up here. The doctrine of persecution for cause of conscience is proved guilty of all the blood of the souls crying out for vengeance under the altar. And then I wanted to read point number 6 as well. This is very interesting to me. I think you'll find it interesting as well. Number 6, it is the will and command of God that since the coming of his Son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciences and worship be granted to all men in all nations and countries. Freedom to believe what you want, freedom to worship in the way that you want to worship. And, he goes on to say, they are only to be fought against with that sword which is only in soul matters able to conquer, that is, the sword of God's Spirit, the Word of God. So he wasn't giving up on those with whom he did not agree. He still wanted to preach the good news. Well, it took several years. Some of the settlements within the colony did not want to actually unite under a single government. They finally did so in 1647, officially establishing the colony of Rhode Island, which he had been calling a lively experience. It had been quite a ride for everybody. Freedom of conscience was again proclaimed. The colony became a safe haven for people persecuted for their beliefs, including those rascally Baptists, quiet Quakers, and Jews. I have no thing to say. Opposition against the new colony's existence, however, continued for many years. So Roger Williams was convinced that there must be a wall of separation between church and state. He said there's no scriptural basis for a state church. He declared, again, I mentioned this earlier, the state should concern itself only with matters of civil order, the first 4 of the 10 Commandments, not with religious belief. The civil government should confine itself to those commandments, the other 6, dealing with relationships of man to man, person to person, murder, theft, adultery, lying, dishonoring parents, and so forth. It was Roger Williams, reportedly, who came up with the well-known metaphor, a wall of separation between church and state. That phrase later popped up in a letter from Thomas Jefferson, the 1801 letter to Danbury Baptists, which he uses, the wall of separation, and that became the basis of the church and state mess that we are still in today. Williams considered it forced worship if the state attempted to promote any particular religious idea or practice, and he declared, quoting, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils," end of quote. On the other hand, most of his contemporaries said that this is a prescription for chaos, and most all of these colonies believed that they should have their own state church that made and enforced both religious and civil rules. Next week, I'm just going to toss the ones I've already used on the floor. Well, let's talk for just a couple of minutes about the wall of separation of church and state. My first question is this: what is your opinion today? What is your opinion of today's meaning of a wall of separation between church and state? Isaac.
Conceptually, it's gone off the rails as far as most people's understanding of the term. Because the idea, based on the way you've presented it, the way it was originated and the way it worked out practically, was that the civil authorities, the state, would have no influence or legal bearing in certain matters. Whereas now they can't even be, they're breaking the rule if they're associated whatsoever. Just the idea of having a Ten Commandments plaque on the wall or something has broken the rule of having legal or some sort of actual effect on one or the other. I don't want to get into it too much because I get a little feisty, but
I can tell.
yeah, the idea is that one shouldn't influence the other so much and be so involved in. They shouldn't be making laws restricting people from doing this and making people do that, but the idea that the state and the civil authority cannot have any association, even in a visible way, of being okay with one religion over another, or vice versa.
Yeah.
That's kind of where we're at with it now.
It's a mess. Julia had a comment, I think. No? You were just... Mosquitoes. Carol?
Well, there's this group that keeps popping up now anytime there's a prayer said in school or anything, you know, they call themselves the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Right.
You know, and, you know, I've always heard that government can't start a religion or they can't impose religion. I like what Roger Williams is saying as far as that goes. I don't think we should be a theocracy. You know, I don't see that in Scripture anywhere. But you know, we still have to pray for the leaders, whoever they are. You know, I may not agree with a particular president that's in office, but I still am obliged to pray for him. You know.
Yeah.
But this whole idea of freedom from religion just irks me. You know.
It's its own religion.
And yeah, that's true. Non-denominationalism is a denomination to itself. But the fact that, okay, this one person is offended about a prayer at school, no matter that, you know, majority of people are okay with it, but one person is all it takes, you know, to shut it down.
It's a mess.
And we see what's happened in our schools. You know, when I was in school, we had a Bible class. You know, it was a public school.
Yeah.
We had a Bible class.
Man, that was a
we
long
prayed
time
before
ago.
every meeting. You know, and now that all that's gone, we see there's no respect, there's no etiquette, there's no consideration for the teachers or even each other. You know.
Well, let's go to our next question. But first, I want to disagree with you. I think we need a theocracy. We just need to have the right king. And he's coming back. Yes. Is a wall of separation needed today?
I just have one more little thing to say.
Oh, it's not going to be a little thing. We've only got this much time.
You made the comment that several people, even in his day, used the word chaos.
Yeah.
And I think trying to apply it as it conceptually exists in a lot of people's minds today is absolute chaos. When at every little turn, every little thing has to be stamped out as against the rules, and it is chaos. When I had a psychology class, and there was an atheist kid in there, and my psychology teacher called him Mr. ACLU, because anytime he went anywhere where that kid thought he shouldn't go, he started talking over him and saying that he was going to turn him in, and
Well,
it was chaos. It was chaos in the classroom
yeah.
because we couldn't even go more than 5 minutes without the teacher saying something that the kid felt he shouldn't say because he's an employee of the county.
What did the teacher call you? Never mind. No more mosquitoes. No, what you got to say?
I was just, I think, what we have to be conscious of is, I think, to me, in looking back at history, you had the Baptists, the Quakers, and the Jews. Jehovah was the God of all three of those groups, Jehovah. But today, I think our life is much more complicated.
Sure.
So if we're gonna, raise the flag Christians, we want this. Well, wall of separation, what about the Muslim, the Buddhist, the Hinduist? You know, we've got to remember, whatever we're going to be tooting our horn about, we need to also realize in our country that that same privilege will be afforded a Muslim.
That's what Williams said in his point number 6. And then he said, we still share the Word of God with them. The last question will make a rhetorical question, and this is for you personally. What is our role? I mean, your personal role as a member of Grace Reformed Baptist Church, if any, in mending the wall of separation, or perhaps in keeping a wall of separation together. But we need to move on. Williams was also an ardent abolitionist. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay passed the first law to make slavery legal in the colonies. And then later, when the United Colonies got together in 1643, this was the military-civil alliance that I mentioned earlier. The law of slavery being legal was applied to the other colonists. Roger Williams, however, was an outspoken opponent of slavery. Rhode Island passed a law in 1652 to prevent slavery in Rhode Island. Now, they ran into a problem because some of the other towns did not want to obey and did not obey the law. As a matter of fact, around 1700, 6-7 years after Roger Williams' death, Newport, Rhode Island became the center of the slave trade in America. Okay, this is what you've been waiting for all night long. Roger Williams was a founding father, I believe, of the Reformed Baptist Church in America. Not too long after he came to the New World, and he came in about 1631. In 1638, he was baptized by a Baptist minister, Ezekiel Holloman. That will be on the quiz. He immediately founded a Baptist church, the First Baptist Church in America. It was a separatist church, or a Calvinist church, or as we would say, a Reformed Baptist church. Am I stretching this too far? I like it too. Soon afterwards, after he had founded this church, a Dr. John Clark took over the church, and he stepped it into Newport, and it's still there today. Roger Williams, however, true to his nature, did not join the church. That was a note. Did you see my note up there? Was that not just the cutest thing? Thank you. Williams died in 1683, sometime between January and March. I don't know if that means that they found his desiccated body in the woodshed. I'm not sure. 50 years later, the house collapsed on itself, and they weren't sure where his grave was. So in 1860, residents of Providence who wanted to raise a monument in his honor at this place where he had been buried, they, quote, dug up the spot, and they found only nails, teeth, and bone fragments, end of quote. And the reason I bring that up is because they also found an apple tree root. These people must have been the forebears of the horror writer Stephen King. They found an apple tree root which they thought was in the shape of a human body, perhaps Roger Williams' body. This root has been on display by the Rhode Island Historical Society since 2007. So next time Gail and Andy are up that way, they're going to need to stop in and take some pictures of the root of all. Williams' career as an author, and he wrote many, many books. It began with A Key into the Languages of America in 1643. This was the first encyclopedia dictionary, primarily of the Algonquin Indian language and culture, the Narragansetts. His most famous work that we talked about, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for Cause and Conscience, was published in 1644. It's considered by some historians as one of the best defenses of liberty of conscience, or soul liberty. His legacy, demanding church purity, advocating the separation of church and state, biblical separation of church and state, defending the Native Americans, fighting slavery, founding a colony, and the American Reformed Baptist Church put him at the center of religious and political life throughout his life. Roger Williams was a man of God a unique and influential figure in both church and Christian history. Are there any questions or comments? No, we've had enough from you tonight.
So if anything you read, the group in 1860 that went looking for him to move in and make a monument, if it had anything to do with his abolitionist ties, that would have been a heated issue at the time and place when that occurred.
Yeah, that's a great question. And next week we're going to be talking about Isaac Newton. So I think it's fitting that Isaac looks that up and shares it with us next week if we have time. Saw another hand back here.
Just a comment. It dawned on me that we could call ourselves the First Reformed Baptist Church in Redmond. Also,
I like it.
and I was just curious about how deeply you dug into this whole soul freedom thing. I mean, are we talking about,
It's
Christian-
primarily liberty of conscience.
Okay.
That your relationship is with God,
Right.
essentially. So you can believe what you want. Now, he was a Christian, and he believed people should become Christians. He shared the gospel. He believed in the gospel. But it's okay if you want to be a Muslim. Now, I probably didn't answer the question that you were asking, though. Go ahead.
Okay, like we don't have to kill you because you are a Muslim, okay? Or okay, I'm okay, you're okay. We're all, I mean, surely it wasn't.
I don't get that impression that it was an I'm okay, you're okay, because he does say that we fight, but we fight with the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. So he wanted the Word to be shared with all of these people, the Turkish, the Jew, the Indians, everyone.
More of a, let's give people civil freedoms so that we
Yeah.
can have an environment in which to share the gospel and Lord willing, save their souls kind of approach.
We'll let that be it. I think that's pretty close. Well, I appreciate you all coming and taking part. Again, next week we have Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, a Christian scientist who has a controversy in his life that we'll talk about. And again, in honor of Isaac Newton, Isaac, will you close our session in prayer?
Thank you, Lord, for this time that you've given us to learn about the history of the church and another man who greatly impacted it for your cause. And I thank you for the time that Gordon has spent in preparation, and I pray that we all be blessed by this and that we would all be built up from this knowledge of history. I pray you be with us as we go about our time these next few days.